We're going up and down, over and over. It's the same old thing. Up and down, over and under.
Well, Dr. Cheri Mah, thank you very much for joining the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, we were catching up a little bit before we started. Life is a little different on the West Coast right now.
Beyond the California and the Bay Area has been hit pretty hard the last month, dealing with fires and poor air and lightning storms and apocalyptic orange skies, in addition to COVID. But we're all hanging in there and taking it day by day.
All of which I'm sure is conducive to a good night of sleep.
Exactly.
Oh, man. Well, hey, so I am so fascinated by the work that you do. And for me personally, sleep has become a really big priority. I would say maybe like the last 5 or 6 years. We were talking, I've got 3 kids, which just tiny little sleep disruptors is really what they are. But I started to notice, I guess I was maybe like 27, 28. I was stealing time away from sleep to kind of make time for the other things in my life that I thought were important. Getting up early to work out, getting to work before everyone else, burning the midnight oil. And as I did that, like a lot of these cracks kind of began to show in my personal life, my physical and mental well-being. So I'm just so fascinated in the area of sleep. It's something that I've tried to educate myself on as best as I can. What interests me about what you're doing is that it seems that you work primarily with elite athletes.
That's correct.
Yeah. Would you mind talking a little bit about, I guess, one, how did you find yourself being drawn to the field of sleep? But then beyond that, like, how did you actually, begin working with athletes?
So I came into the field of sleep medicine about 18 years ago. I was a young Stanford undergrad and met Dr. William Dement. So he's considered the father of modern sleep medicine. The field is quite young. It's only about 50, 60 years old. And he started a lot of the field from his early work back in the 1950s, 60s. A lot of it initially at Stanford too. And I met him and I just was really fascinated with what he was doing. And the field was so young. There's still a lot of questions that are unanswered. Why do we even sleep?
Right.
Is still quite a mystery. We understand a little bit, obviously, on what happens when we don't sleep and some of those effects. But I thought it was just really fascinating because we all experience this process every single night that's been so critical and ingrained in our DNA for eons. But it's still so young and there's still more for us to understand about how this affects our well-being, our functioning. And most of the field has initially been focused on the negative effects of insufficient sleep and when we don't get enough sleep on a regular basis. But what I started to be fascinated with as an undergrad and then as my graduate work at Stanford was looking at, well, what's the other half of the story of how do we enhance sleep and recovery and how can we positively benefit daytime functioning? And then ultimately for the athletes that I study is how do we positively benefit their physiology and then their physical performance?
Yeah.
And I had access to wonderful athletes, top of the collegiate athletes at Stanford. And so, my aha moment was when we weren't looking at athletes and we're looking at how do you pay back accumulated sleep debt in sleep deprived undergraduates. And if we can pay back some of that sleep debt, we started to see cognitive benefits, improved reaction time, improved levels of fatigue. And some swimmers were in that study and, said, hey, I just wanted to let you know, I set a couple of personal records on my last swim meet. And so that's when the light bulb went off in my head that said, this would be really interesting specifically to study in athletes, because obviously athletes are a special demographic, motivated by performance. They care about their physical performance outputs. And so that's when I fast forwarded to my master's year and then stayed 7 years to look at additional sports at Stanford, from swimmers to football players to the rest of a lot of the varsity teams, and really started to examine how we pay back accumulated sleep debt. Now, the basketball team, we started to see performance improvements, 9% improvement in free throw shooting, 9% improvement in three-point shots, faster sprint times, faster reaction times. And obviously for these athletes, 1% is a huge gain. So So this was something that I think was, interesting because we were actually quantifying it for the first time, right? It's not too hard to understand that maybe, you improve some of your sleep and your recovery, that you might see some positive benefits, but this was at least some of the initial quantification of what does it mean specifically for an athlete population on their reaction time? What does it mean to affect their sprint time if we do this over multiple weeks? So that was sort of 50% of my time for those 7 years. And then I started to look at the pro sports and I was like, why are not a lot of these teams leveraging what we understand as basic fundamentals of sleep science? Because I would go to teams and ask, why do you travel to an NFL team like at 2 p.m. every Friday, regardless if you're going to the West Coast or East Coast. And I encountered that very regularly, that a lot of these pro athletes and teams just didn't have a lot of focus on sleep or specifically their travel strategies. And I think it just, it stems from the fact that the sleep science is much younger than, say, nutrition or, say, the physical training and the strength and conditioning field that has been, implemented a little bit more into the sports performance and sports science programs at the top of the level. And sleep is just sort of the newcomer at this point. And so that was really what drew me to also start to work with different teams. So at this point, I do work with teams in the NBA, NFL, NHL, and Major League Baseball to really try to apply the science and try to make changes into a far from ideal travel schedule. But how can we make strategies before they fly, when they fly, and then when they get off the plane to try and minimize jet lag and try to make athletes have scenarios in which they can recover as best as possible given these imperfect schedules.
Yeah. So, okay. So, one of the things that I think is really interesting to hear is the fact that sports teams weren't taking this into consideration. And how recent was this that you started like reaching out to them to help in that capacity?
This is around 2007,
Oh, wow.
2008. So I've been at this obviously for a number of years, but it's still at that time was still astounding to me that obviously there's so much invested in a lot of these individual athletes and obviously teams as a
Oh,
whole
yeah.
to perform. And obviously in some leagues, you only have a limited number of games in a season, even when you have, MLB with, games every other day, and if not more frequently than that, still there's a lot that rides on these games. And to not factor in strategies to improve recovery on the road or minimize jet lag when you're crossing the country multiple times, sometimes in a given week, was kind of astounding to me. And so I recognized that there was a need that should there be teams that were interested in the research and wanting to improve upon their current protocols and practices, that this would be a really unique opportunity because, again, the motivation for performance is high at this level. And I really saw that a lot of athletes could probably benefit from it, just seeing how sleep deprived my collegiate athletes were and the performance
Yeah.
benefit that they saw. So you just kind of take that one step higher and imagine that this is obviously something that could be quite beneficial for not just the individual athletes, but organizations as a whole that were forward enough thinking to want to embrace some of these practices. So you start from the ground, but, and you see a spectrum of some organizations that want to do a couple of things and then others that want to do everything and everything because they recognize that this might be an untapped area of competitive advantage. So it's been a fun process, and I think we still have a ways to go. And like I mentioned, I've been at this now for a number of years, but I would still say that there's a much more that we need to do to try and make sure that this is also important equally to that of the physical training and also the nutrition as well.
Yeah. And I mean, you said something even at the beginning of this podcast, which I still find so astounding, the fact that we just don't even understand why we sleep. Can you talk about this? To your point, you said, look, this is something that we all do every night. It should represent roughly like a third of our day. But the fact that we still don't understand from like a scientific perspective, like why we sleep, like, I guess maybe can you expand a little bit about what you mean by that?
Sure. No, I mean, exactly as I mentioned, we have we have researched and studied sleep and the effects of being sleep deprived and the effects
Right.
of having insufficient sleep, so less than your body requires every day, and what kind of effects does that have cognitively or physically or physiologically. In our case, I study athletes, so how does that affect physical performance? But
Hmm.
we still, are trying to elucidate more about this really fascinating process, and breaking down even the stages of sleep. You have non-rapid eye movement sleep, and then you also have the deeper sleep, and then also you have the rapid eye movement sleep when we dream. And
Hmm.
those different stages are critical for different aspects of recovery, from muscle recovery to memory consolidation. But we're still trying to untangle some of these components, and how that affects us from an acute standpoint. So how does that affect us, say, the next day, but also long term? How does chronic sleep deprivation over
Hmm.
many years to decades, how does that also impact your health risks, your performance errors, and how's that going to play into what that looks like down the road? So we still have a ways to go. But I find it really interesting because it is something that we know is so crucial and foundational to not just our daytime functioning, but for us to be at our best every day. And it's
Yeah.
unfortunately one that we all, as you mentioned, sacrifice and overlook. And it's one of the first things that we cut off, and when our schedules get really busy, that is the one thing that we tend to sacrifice, right? But yet
Yeah.
we all, I'm sure, intuitively know what a good night's sleep has been and meant, and how we feel and function during that, versus when we've had insufficient sleep or a really rough night of sleep,
Hmm.
getting only a couple of hours of rest. But yet it is the one thing that really can provide such a strong foundation for us to be at our best every day.
Well, and it's so interesting too, like you said, it sounds like what we've been able to do fairly effectively is measure the symptoms that occur when we don't get enough sleep, right? We were able to hone in on that. But the fact that like there's this just broad horizon of areas still to kind of be explained and discovered, I also think is so fascinating. But one thing that you mentioned at the beginning, so, a lot of the folks who listen to the show still are athletically inclined, or they have something they're pursuing. You mentioned a couple percentages that I thought were really interesting about the positive impact. And actually, you said something specifically, pay back sleep debt, right? That was kind of like the focus when you were at Stanford, and like kind of the positive benefit that had on everything from like free throws to people breaking PRs and swimming. What specifically was the team trying to achieve in terms of like paying back sleep debt? What does that mean?
Sure. So to step back for a second to define what sleep debt is, right? Your
Yeah, I thought
body
that. Yeah.
needs a certain amount of sleep every single night, which we call your individual sleep requirement. And
Mm,
that can vary, but the minimum amount that's recommended for every healthy adult is 7 hours of sleep a night. That's the
yeah.
minimum threshold. But honestly, I feel terrible on 7 hours of sleep. I much more need, 8 to 9 hours. So there is individual differences. You do need to find how much sleep you feel refreshed and rejuvenated and function well throughout the day. Now, when you don't meet that requirement every night, so say you're only getting 5 hours of sleep a night,
Yeah.
then you build up a debt like a credit card conceptually, right? So if you go Monday to Friday, a normal work week, and you've only gotten 5 hours of sleep, but say you needed that 7 hours, then you're in debt 2 hours every day. So at the end of the week,
Mm,
conceptually, the idea is you built up 10 hours of sleep debt, right? Then it
yeah.
comes to the weekend, and a lot of people will sleep in, get an extra hour or two. You'll feel better and you'll feel more refreshed. But in this bigger picture, say instead of that 7 hours on that Saturday, you slept maybe 9 hours
Hmm.
instead. And so you'll feel more refreshed on those 9 hours, but in that bigger picture, you've only paid back 2 hours of that debt when you had 10
Mm.
hours accumulated prior. Does that make sense?
It
So
does.
that's a concept of accumulated sleep that most of us probably do carry around some amount. How much can vary between individual to individual. And a question that comes up a lot as well, maybe Cheri, do I have like thousands of hours of debt built up since I've been not sleeping well, since I was 20 or so? And
Hmm.
that's not, I think we're still trying to figure out, how much sleep that you can really pay back. And we do think that in some of our shorter studies, we can pay back debt that you've accumulated in the last week or the last couple of months or so. And it's questionable. I think it's still be determined whether you can pay back some of the longer chronic sleep debt that's been potentially built up, just
That's
because we know
exactly
that there's
where,
health
yeah.
consequences, right? If you've been sleeping 5 hours a night for the past 3 decades, then some of those health consequences that are often linked may be harder to reverse at that point. But at least some of what we focused on is, at least in the short term, can we reduce some of that accumulated debt? And we do think that you can do in the short term. So that's what I focused on in the duration of anywhere from a couple of days to some of my longer studies have looked at paying back that sleep debt in athletes for 5 to 7 weeks. And I think that's a really an important point, is that a lot of us, I think the general public thinks that you should sleep in and pay back your debt in a weekend of rest. So one night or a Saturday and a Sunday, and you'll feel better. But I think what is like the really important take home point is that what we see is that you might see some improvement and you'll feel a little bit more refreshed, but oftentimes to make a significant dent in that sleep debt will probably take longer than that one weekend of quality rest. So I'm encouraging a lot of my athletes, if you have a vacation period, even if it's like 1 week, 2 weeks would probably be the biggest bang for your buck to really try and extend that sleep duration, and to do so gradually. So you're not trying to go from 6 hours suddenly to 10 hours, but first, you want to get adequate sleep, even reaching that 7-hour threshold. And it is all about going small steps in the right direction. But if you can extend your sleep for, even that 1 week or 2 week period, that's probably going to be more beneficial than just trying to do it just for that one night or a 1 weekend of quality rest.
See, that helps, because I've heard said before, you can't pay back your sleep debt, which has always been a little confusing to me, because then, kind of to your point, the folks were like, well, does that mean I'm just going to forever carry around thousands of hours of sleep debt? So that's a little encouraging that over time, through good habits, you can start to pay a lot of that back. So I guess there is some benefit then to, let's say you're a new parent, just hypothetically, and you have had a terrible week of sleep. It is beneficial to where you can start to like chip away at some of that debt. So if you are able to, on a Saturday morning, sleep in an extra 2 hours, like absolutely take advantage of that. Is that correct?
I would encourage that. I think that there's obviously some balance to it. You don't want to shift your whole sleep and wake schedule drastically. So you don't want to wake up, 3 hours later than you typically would, because you can also experience what we call social jet lag. So we've all experienced the jet lag where you get on an airplane, you go to another time zone, and then you feel terrible because you've had to shift your body clock as a result, and takes multiple days. But you can also do that to yourself, just staying at home and in your own time zone. And because oftentimes on Fridays or Saturdays, folks will stay up later because they want to, socialize and do other things, and then sleep in later. And that's actually having the exact same effect, and it's called social jet lag. So it's within reason. I do think that, yes, if you've been a sleep deprived parent for the last 5 days and you have an opportunity on the Saturday to try and get an extra hour and get, say, maybe 7 hours to that 8 hours, I do think that would definitely be beneficial. The other thing you can do is also leverage the power naps. Power naps are fantastic, and you want to keep them to 20 to 30 minutes is my recommendation. The 20 to 30-minute power nap, if timed correctly in the afternoon period, after lunch to the afternoon, is when you have this drop in your circadian rhythm. So you're more likely to fall asleep. And that will give you a boost in energy and performance for about a couple of hours, somewhere around 2 to 3 hours. But if you keep it short, then it keeps you in lighter stages of sleep. And so when you wake up, you should still be able to go about your day and function and have that benefit from the nap. Have you ever taken a longer nap where it's 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, and you woke
horrible.
up? Yeah, you've woken up more groggy and sluggish. So that's called sleep inertia, where it's that grogginess feeling. And the reason why is because you're waking up from deeper stages of sleep. And that also, not only because you feel more groggy when you wake up from those deeper stages of sleep, but it can also prevent you from going to sleep later in the nighttime and make it more challenging, because your drive to sleep is not as high. So that's why you keep it in the shorter 20 to 30 minutes, prevent yourself from going into those deeper stages, and then you'll have that benefit. Now, if you're a real sleep deprived parent, then the magic trick on top of just the power nap is to take the caffeine nap,
Okay, so I'm so glad you brought this up. I was just about to ask you. And let me also say, I'm sure listeners were like, Ken, that is probably the worst question you've ever asked. Of course, get the extra hour of sleep. But I'm glad I did, because now we're talking about the social jet lag, which I think is really important. But yes, please talk about the caffeine nap, because I was actually going to ask you about this.
The caffeine nap, also known as the nappuccino, the caffeine nap, you name it. It has been shown. So, what you do is you take a cup of coffee or some caffeine, drink it. Usually, caffeine takes about 15 minutes to kick in. Now, if you are so sleep deprived that you can fall asleep within 5 to 10 minutes, that's actually not a great sign. That means you actually have accumulated sleep debt, because it really should take you around 10 to 20 minutes to fall asleep on average. But a lot of people just, think that they should pass out as fast as possible. If you can, that's actually an indication that maybe you're not getting enough sleep. But this is why the caffeine nap can be helpful for you. So you take the caffeine, you go take a 20-minute power nap. And then when you wake up, then bam, both the caffeine and the nap will have kicked in. And that has been shown in some studies to be more efficacious than just the nap alone or just the caffeine alone.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. You just combined two of my favorite things, napping and caffeine. Perfect. Okay. That's actually really helpful. So now I'm cheating here, because I know that you've done some really awesome work around NBA schedules. But what I'm wondering too is, did you first start working at the organizational level, helping the professional sporting teams making better decisions around scheduling, travel, preparation? Or did you actually start working with the individual athletes themselves? And I guess, I guess there's also an option where the answer is both. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Originally it was organizations that were approaching me to try and take a holistic approach of how to improve sleep and recovery, and obviously also travel and schedules for the organization. But obviously
Yeah.
within that is nestled individual work with athletes, because at the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to individual and customized plans. And not every, like the rookie is different than the veteran. Obviously there's different lifestyle factors. And so everyone is at a different place in terms of also their approaches to sleep. So I do individual work with athletes, but initially was approached by teams to assist with things like their travel schedules. And at this point, I do both. So I work with teams and then athletes within those organizations, and then individual athletes as well that are just interested in trying to optimize their own performance.
Well, and you mentioned this earlier. I mean, the amount of money that these organizations spend on these players, the fact that sleep was overlooked, and I mean, granted, it's overlooked across the entirety of society. So not to like paint these sports organizations in a bad light, but yeah, it's like they're investing so much money in their physical well-being. The fact that it was not being taken into consideration, like how do we make sure these guys are getting optimal sleep, is really kind of astounding. And I guess, what finally drove that awakening, so to speak, within professional sports organizations? Was it the ability for your team to point to actually not just like the detriment of lack of sleep, but actually the enhancement that you can get from optimal sleep in terms of sports performance? Was that one of kind of like the leading drivers?
I think there's been a gradual shift over at least what I've seen in the last, over 10 plus years or so. I think that there's been more research and studies that have come out and sleep, and specifically an athlete population, that's helped drive those conversations and have good studies that can support the evidence for what those effects are in terms of jet lag or sleep deprivation effects in athlete populations. So I think that definitely helped in the conversation. I think there's also been the general public is more aware and educated about sleep. Still ways to go, but I think that there's more recognition that it's a fundamental component of mental health, and not just the exercise nutrition component, but there's that pillar also of healthy sleep. And I've seen that, as well as kind of the boom of sleep wearable technology, I think, has helped in that conversation,
Mm,
especially with pro sport too, which have obviously utilized technology in certain organizations to help monitor and track and be able to quantify some of these metrics in terms of customizing protocols for their athletes. And then I think there's also been a contribution of the media. There's been more coverage, I think, both with the general population and then also sports specific coverage that have helped some of these conversations. And you've mentioned one of the projects that I was involved in with ESPN and the Schedule Alert project. And we hope that
yeah.
that might have helped bring to light some of the other factors beyond the strength of team that revolve specifically around scheduling, the density of games, where those games are being played that can potentially affect game outcomes or have some contributing factor into how these teams will play. And,
I
our
wish
accuracy.
I wish I would have known about this because there's a lot of sports bets that I would love to have back now, having been aware of your research. Because
That
you
was
had a
one
real
application of it. I mean, in the spirit of the project, we were just trying to highlight, hey, that there's these fatigue related, travel related factors that
yeah.
can potentially put certain games at risk of losses, and predicting those out at the beginning of the season and allowing readers and viewers to follow along and see how accurate we were. And we did this for 3 seasons from 2016 through 2019. And the
Mhm.
highest risk games over those 3 seasons were accurate on a win loss of 76 to about 86%. And
That's
again, a lot of
incredible.
factors go into that. Strength of team obviously factors into that, but we, in the spirit of the project, didn't consider that in the prediction. So,
Oh, you didn't.
again,
That was
no,
not considered. The prediction was solely
yes,
based
the
on
prediction was
wow.
solely based on the travel factors and fatigue factors. It did not incorporate strength of team. We recognize and acknowledge that that very much will influence game outcomes. But in the spirit of the project, we said strictly based on these factors of scheduling, where we will still publish out the top X many
Wow.
games. Sometimes there's like 40, some of the highest risk ones were, anywhere from, 7 to 17 or so, and then allow people to follow that. And again, we hope that this at least highlighted that there's these other additional factors that we don't often think about. We often think about just the strength of team A versus team B,
Right.
and how that's going to play out. But there's other factors that hopefully now will be at least considered in how the schedule is devised and also how teams
Yeah.
hopefully approach them. So we like to say that there's a combination of these factors that I think teams have started to recognize the importance of it, and help driving individual organizations and leagues as a whole to also recognize that these are things to consider and when they devise how the season will look and how they will travel with teams to various locations.
Yeah. Well, so we had Eric Hosmer on the show. Guy, I mean, I go episode 10. And he's the first baseman for the Padres. And that's one of the things we were talking about is just how insane the Major League Baseball schedule is and these crazy road trips. And it's funny, at face value, just looking at the time of game, the location, like it doesn't look great. But then when you get to hear from their perspective what it actually means in terms of travel, they might wrap up a game at 9 or 10, then they go to the locker room, they do all their press. And then after all that, they still have to make their way to the airport. They have to board a plane. They fly at night. They have to land. It's insane. And I actually, it makes you wonder, kind of to your point, like exactly what sort of product are they capable of putting on the field, when you're making them fight this uphill battle. You're
Yeah, and
taking
you
away
bring up
their
a point too of MLB. So each league schedule is really fascinating to me, and that is part of how I look at how these teams will travel. But the NBA schedule looks very different than MLB versus the
Mm,
NFL, who's playing one game a week, right?
right.
MLB schedule is really insane, where they have very few off days between basically playing a game every other day of the week. The advantage of MLB is that they often have several games in one location, season. So
Yeah.
there is some advantage of that versus, I would say, when you look at the NBA schedule, this year is obviously atypical, which we should get
Mhm.
into in a second. But in the normal NBA schedule, they're zipping across the country to different cities almost every other day.
Yeah.
And the point being of this season, I think, is really fascinating because with the NBA bubble, there's no travel this year.
Yeah.
There's no travel fatigue. There's more consistency in their sleep environments. There's more consistency in their regular day to day. There's less of the jet lag. And there has been conversation around how that's affected, most often in a positive light, how that's provided a more energized group of athletes and some really amazing performances on the court. And
Mm.
does the travel and factor contribute to that, or the lack of it this season? Obviously, again, this is a very atypical season, a lot of other factors and stressors at play too, but has been a topic of conversation within the league.
Yeah. So from your perspective, and I guess in the conversations that you're having, is the expectation that it's generally probably improved performance? And I guess, is there any preliminary data or feedback that would suggest that's accurate?
So that's the conversation. I think that's
Yeah.
ongoing, at least with particularly the NBA bubble. I haven't seen any published data around it so far, but that would be very fascinating to look at. I think it's just a conversation in terms of anecdotally what
Yeah.
teams and organizations and staff are thinking about the recovery and the performance of their players, and what we see obviously as a product on the court.
And to your point, there's no shortage of additional stressors that could be impacting performance as well this season for those guys. So
Exactly.
a lot to take into consideration. So one of the things that I would love to learn a little bit about is how you actually work with these individual athletes. Like when you go to work with a client, I guess, what is the process that you go through in terms of helping them? Like, maybe, I guess, I imagine there's some sort of assessment phase, and then what kind of comes after that to help them hopefully improve their sleep.
Yeah, sure. I think it depends on the athlete. I would say
Mm.
a lot of athletes start at very different places. Some athletes who come to me and are veteran athletes have never looked at their sleep before. So we're really starting at the basics, and ground zero of what they understand about sleep. What do they do and how do they approach their sleep, if there is even any approach to their sleep? What are some of the common challenges they experience? Because again, an MLB player playing until extra innings looks very different than, say, an NFL player playing
Hmm.
one game a week and having a much earlier end time. um, you know, do they have other lifestyle factors? Are they married with kids? Looks very different than a single athlete.
Yeah.
And what are the things that they want to focus on? Do they want to incorporate objective sleep monitoring? Some really gravitate towards that. Others don't really feel inclined to need to do that, and really want to work on other aspects that we know are going to build better habits long term.
Hmm.
And what are the goals that they want to accomplish too with their sleep? you know I see also this shift with some of the younger athletes. I would say, even in the last couple of years, say the minor league players that are coming up into the major league players, many of them are, I think, more in tune with actually some of the newer research and some of the sports science than I would say some of the veteran players have been, just because that's just a shift, I think, in training and in what we're integrating at a younger and earlier level. Right, they're
Yeah.
already excited and wanting to do more in the sports science, and whether that's objective monitoring or whether that's just recognizing and understanding that they have to incorporate other recovery modalities, and sleep is one component of that. It's
Hmm.
already kind of in their baseline, which I think is a very different conversation sometimes than other players who have been in the leagues and have found a lot of success, and you're now trying to also convince them that, hey, this sleep and recovery thing might also be beneficial to them, in addition to what they've already done and found to have a lot of success in the past.
Yeah, it really is. It's just so incredible. I mean, we know so much about nutrition. We know so much about training. The fact that at that level where you're trying to eke out every type of possible advantage, both as an individual, just given the stakes that are on the line, the fact that, like, there still needs to be an education as to why this matters is just, I mean, I think in itself so interesting. Um, so, when you're trying to get someone set up on kind of like an optimal, I mean, maybe sleep schedule is even just one component of it. I guess, what are the certain, like, areas of sleep that you're assessing where you're looking for areas of improvement?
There's a couple of different areas. So you hit on the sleep schedule or the timing of their sleep. That's just one
Yeah.
bucket. There's a couple other buckets I look at. Sleep duration is obviously key. And I think a lot of folks focus on sleep duration just because we feel like it's a little bit more controllable about when we go to bed and what time we wake up. But the reality is
Right.
we often are not sleeping during that full duration that we're attempting to sleep at nighttime. But duration is going to be critical, and evaluating if they're at least meeting the threshold of 7 hours.
Mhm.
Arguably, many of us, do really recommend 8 to 10 hours for elite athletes, because
The
we really
physical
recognize that there's
demands.
right, exactly. There's a lot more physiological demand. And then also, I account for the fact that a lot of athletes will say they get, say, 8 hours of sleep. But if you objectively look at the quantification of their sleep, it tends to be less. So sometimes that's
Mm.
7.5 or 7 hours. In addition to, again, most of us have accumulated sleep debt. So we need to start to pay that back little by little. So trying to even get closer into the range of, say, that 8 to the 9 is going to be more beneficial than I think hovering closer to that 7 hour mark. So there's
Ah,
that. That's the sleep duration. And again, it's all
okay.
about small steps. So it's not about going from 6 hours and then suddenly jumping to 10, right? It's about,
Mhm.
let's try to get you to 7. Can we get you from 7 to 7.5 this week? Can we try to challenge you to get to 8 for like this month, right? And it's all about those small steps, and you will make gains, and people will start to connect the dots and recognize how that additional change affects kind of their day to day, and usually are more willing to then take on additional challenges in terms of how to improve their sleep. So then the second
Mm.
bucket is really about sleep quality, right? And
Okay.
there's a lot of different factors that go into quality of rest. But for example, I'll evaluate in regards to caffeine, alcohol consumption.
Mhm.
Caffeine is going to keep you up at night, depending on when you consume caffeine. The half life is about 6 hours. So, even having something at dinner time very much can affect your sleep. Alcohol, obviously, it can help you fall asleep, but it also very much can fragment your rest. And so, it can cause you to wake up a lot during the nighttime and feel more tired throughout the day. So, not a lot of people always are making wise choices on when they're consuming alcohol. How's their regular hydration status? So some athletes will not hydrate
Mm.
well throughout the day and then chug a lot of water right before bed and then wake up multiple times during the nighttime.
Yep.
So those are some of the easier fixes. You want to hydrate well through the day, but then also minimize some of that fluid towards the end of the nighttime.
Mhm.
Is there, do they have an approach to sleep? So do they have a wind down routine? That's one of the easiest and best recommendations I can make, because so many of us don't have a transition period from the busyness of our day to actually preparing our bodies to sleep. And that's what I found to be one of the most important
Ah,
triggers, is that as soon as athletes can start to understand that they can prepare to recover and that they're preparing to still get work done at nighttime, so to say, that's when they start to connect those dots, that their day is not done as soon as they walk out of the gym or out of the training facility, that there's still important work to be done during the nighttime, and they can actually prepare. So it's just like you prepare to go out onto
yeah.
the field with training, or you stretch and you do a lot of other um, you know work prior to getting out onto the field to train. Same thing, you can prepare yourself to sleep and have the best success leading up to the time that you're going to go to bed. So do you have a wind
I
down
love
routine?
and I love that example too. And I just I feel like that's so important because I have to imagine a lot of this is just for athletes and just people in general. Like there's a needed shift in perspective. And I think what you said, there's a lot of work to be done. It kind of just helps it becomes a little more clear that like this is not just downtime, or this is not dead time that you can chip away at so that you can fit in all these other things you're trying to do. Like this is such an important piece of like the work that you're doing. So yeah, I love that soundbite. I think that's a great way to approach it. And so I apologize. I'm cutting you off from your buckets.
No, that's fine. Yeah, work to be done at nighttime. You're still doing work, not in the same sense, but important that it's going to give yourself the foundation so that you can go out and do the physical training and what needs to get done on the field the following day.
Mm,
If you're not
yeah.
giving yourself that proper recovery time, then you're just going to be at a deficit, right? because you have to charge your body, your batteries at nighttime. And if you're only going to charge it up 60% with 6 hours of sleep, then you're going to run out a lot faster.
Yeah.
So yeah, do you have a wind down routine, whether that's reading or deep breathing exercises? I have a lot of athletes do meditation, or sometimes for those that have a racing mind, which is a very common issue for a lot of athletes, then I have them even do like foam rolling and stretching prior to their wind down routine. So all those things will factor into the quality of rest, as well as, for example, your sleep environment. So make it like a cave, really dark, quiet, cool, and comfortable. You want to aim for 60 to 67 degrees, but you can knock down that temperature. You're starting at like 70 every couple of days. Blackout curtains is going to be ideal to block out the light. Your environment very much can affect your sleep, and especially if you're in the summer months, the temperature can really cause more disrupted sleep at nighttime. So there's more that goes into that quality.
60 to 67.
60 to 67.
Oh,
Correct.
man.
60 to 68. It sounds very cold, right? So
my wife's not going to like this, but
yeah, don't freeze out the bed partner, please. So start at a reasonable temperature that you're used to,
right.
and then slowly decrease a degree or two.
I heard 60.
Yeah.
No,
one actual practical tip that I've actually had to share with some athletes, because they have a bed partner who likes a different temperature. You can actually do like 2 different comforters. That has worked for some of my athletes, so that if you like different temperature regulation, that allows then for preferences to be better controlled.
Yeah. And again, I know I'm breaking up your flow here, but do you even get into everything from like the type of mattress, the comforter? Like, does it get that granular?
Yes, it definitely can. I also look at how they're sleeping on the road versus at home. And, thinking about, I'm sure you've experienced a poor night of sleep on the road at some point or in a hotel. I do think that, your pillow preferences can make a difference, especially if you're a pro athlete that's on the road all the time. If you wake up with a terrible night of sleep and cranked your neck, that's not going to be great for you going out onto the field. So I oftentimes have like my athletes even travel with their own pillows to make sure that that's like a controlled environment as much as possible, because we know you're going to be at very different environments throughout the whole season. So I do get into, I think details matter, and I think they add up over a whole season.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the kind of recurring theme I'm hearing is, and this has come up quite a few times, but it's like consistency over an extended amount of time is what is really going to be advantageous.
Exactly.
So,
I think that comes up too in emphasizing to athletes that we're all going to have a bad night's sleep here or there, and that's going to be okay. I've had some athletes sort of stress out about a really bad night of sleep, or if they had an objective monitor, they were seeing poor numbers return that night after, and were very concerned that was going to affect how they played. And in those scenarios, I think it's just good to step back and say, hey, we're all going to have a rough night of sleep here and there, and it's going to be okay. What matters more is, how did you sleep this week leading up into this important event or game? What did we do in the last month? How have we prepared you in the regular season, in advance of this, so that, yes, when you experience a poor night, then we can at least take another tool out of the tool belt and try to prevent that from happening a subsequent night. But, that's more important than just one night in isolation.
yeah. And that's one of wearable technology is constantly evolving, but that is, regardless of how accurate some of these things are, I have heard that kind of positioned as a potential negative consequence of all this detailed monitoring of every aspect of our lives, is it can actually be a source of anxiety. So maybe, if we could really quickly, and I know we were catching it before, we could talk probably an entire hour just about wearable technology alone, but it sounds like you are using wearable technology with some of the athletes that you work with. Is this the sort of wearable technology that's available like on the retail market, like, the common sleep tools or trackers that the average person's aware of? Or are you using something that I suppose might be like a bit more accurate?
Sure. So objective monitoring, I think, is approached very differently dependent on the individual athlete or on the organization. So there's a spectrum of wearables that are used in pro sport. I use everything from research grade technology to some
Hmm.
of the consumer wearable technology, because that was the preference of, say, an athlete already using it or an organization that had already been using that platform. I think the there is, wide spectrum accuracy and validation for these products, but more importantly is how are you using that information and what is the purpose
Yeah.
of it, right? If it's to capture, just a general sense of how an athlete is sleeping and their patterns, whether it's shifting drastically, due to their sleep and wake schedule, are we using it really just to get a better sense of their sleep patterns? Then that can be a very useful tool. And does it give the athlete some information on a daily basis that they find helpful to have as some feedback? Again, you have to balance that with some potential negative effects if they're really focused on those numbers and they are stressed when those numbers are not ideal.
Yeah.
But the way in which you use that information, I think, is more important. Versus like, are you trying to use this for research purposes? And obviously, we're using research grade equipment for that purpose.
Yeah. And so is that where you're getting a lot of that? Because we talked about quantity, right? Quantity is important, but then quality is kind of like that deeper level. Is like, hey, look, it's important to go beyond just how long were you lying in bed, right? It's understanding all the things that are actually happening while you're sleeping. Um, is the quality being tracked primarily with like this research grade tracking technology, or is some of that like actually like qualitative, like self-reported, like how do you feel? I guess, and I guess maybe I'm actually asking from a place of like for the average person who doesn't have access to someone who's going to help them track their sleep, like what are maybe some of the things that they can start to pay attention to?
Sure. So quality has various definitions. One way to look at that, just specifically with awakenings, is that the total amount of time that you should be awake during the whole night in total. So if you have multiple awakenings during the night, you go to the bathroom twice and you go back to bed, and it's 5 minutes each time. It's the total amount of that time should be less than 30 minutes. So that's kind of just a
Mm,
benchmark for everyone to aim for. That if you're waking up a couple times, going back to bed, not a problem. If you're regularly up in bed for 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, that's probably at a place in which we would want to like readdress why you're having these awakenings and not able to fall back asleep from a quality
yeah.
standpoint. At the pro level, it depends on, again, the organization or the athlete and how they look at quality. We can see some of the objective quality measures through objective monitoring. Either subjective reports are also important, and then it can depend, on what their lifestyle behavioral habits are, right? Like, so things like, again, caffeine and alcohol, some of their
Yeah.
nutrition can also potentially affect their sleep, where they're traveling from, what environments there are they in the off season versus regular season? Those things can also affect like their quality measures. But I think more importantly, the objective monitoring is actually most helpful for looking at these bigger picture shifts in their sleep patterns, and then
Mm,
they're generally more accurate in terms of sleep duration. So looking at approximate bedtime, wake time, and the amount during the nighttime is what I tend to use it a little bit more so than necessarily relying on some of the measures for specific sleep staging. Um,
yeah. No, that is helpful. And if I may ask, and you can tell me that Ken, this is too personal, but are you tracking your own sleep?
I have on and off.
Ah, okay.
I am a fan of generally the wearable technology. I am positioned here living in the Silicon Valley. It's a
Yeah.
really unique environment. I get exposed to a lot of the up and coming technologies. And, when I started doing some of this work back in 2007, we really only had research grade technology, and it's not the best in terms of the user interface or for an athlete to be able to
Oh,
see that information on a regular basis. I think looking at the trends is, again, more important for the athlete than the individual night. But I think that I've gotten to experience some of the evolution of the sleep technology, and so I do definitely on and off track what it is night to night. Not every single night do I do it, but that's because I feel like I've gotten a sense of what my trend has been, and I don't necessarily feel like I need that necessarily every single night. But I do think in general, when someone is first trying to understand a little bit more about their sleep and interested in trying to make some changes, some of the objective monitoring can be helpful just to help someone connect the dots, to recognize what happens at nighttime and then how they feel or how they train and the effects during the daytime. And it doesn't have to be using objective monitoring and wearables, even as simple as writing a sleep journal just on a pen and paper. What was your bedtime? What was your wake time? And actually keeping that log is actually very informative. And I think most people are very surprised when they physically have to write it down, how much it's not what they thought it was when they look back.
Is it more the duration is not what most people expect, or is it just like the sporadic nature
It's
that
both.
most people?
It's
Ah,
both. I think most people often overestimate how much they're sleeping,
okay.
and then tend to also have more erratic schedules than they might expect.
Ah, okay. Yeah, it's the erratic schedule that's been getting me lately. And again, we've got a bunch of young kids, and they
Mhm.
don't quite care how much I sleep. So,
And this time
uh,
is like kind of interesting too with COVID. So what we're seeing with difference in schedules, by some of my colleagues who are starting to look at COVID trends in the last couple of months, is that
oh,
with work
interesting.
from home, it seems that there's less of that social jet lag that we were talking about earlier, where the schedule actually is a little bit more consistent than you would expect on a typical Monday to Friday work week, and then your home
Yeah.
life Saturday and Sunday for a lot of working individuals. So there's less of that shift, but people have worse sleep quality, which I think for many,
Oh, interesting.
understandably, yeah, and during this time period are having a lot of additional stressors and dealing with
Yeah.
loss and dealing with uncertainty and social economic issues. And so the quality seems to be worse despite people having less of a shifted schedule. So
Hmm.
that can also be, again, specific to this time point, but something that we're all working through together.
Yeah, all experiencing together. And it's funny. I think my entire 20s was nothing but social jet lag. So that probably explains a lot of what went on at that time. Okay, maybe we can. This just came up. I was just thinking about it specifically, kind of within the arena of sport. This idea of chronotypes. Maybe this can kind of be just the last point we hit. But I guess the first question should be, does chronotype impact athletic performance? Is that something that's generally accepted? Is there still research to be done on that topic?
Sure. So chronotype referring to there's a predilection for a lot of us to either be a morning lark or an evening owl, in the sense of
Mm.
having more alertness and at certain points in the day that might be different from one chronotype to the other chronotype.
And I
Um,
guess maybe the first question then is like, is that accurate?
Yes, so there has
Okay.
been
There
yes, there has
you go.
been a predilection to be one chronotype. There's some in kind of this middle chronotype, and then kind of more towards the evening chronotype. And I'm sure we all kind of have
Yeah.
an innate sense of what that is for ourselves. If but it can also potentially be very much influenced by our social behaviors, right? So, for
Mm.
example, I'm naturally a night person, but because
Okay.
of my hat that I wear, I'm also a physician, so I'm forced to wake up quite early, and so because of that, I'm having to be on a more of a morning lark chronotype. So it can very much be influenced by your social activities and the type of schedule that you set yourself on.
Okay.
But despite you can have obviously your innate chronotype. Now that can have some impact on for elite athletes and when they may want to select to train. Very much so that you may want to select different times that are fit within your chronotype.
Okay.
So, like a night person is going to want to train potentially in a later period than, say, a morning lark would. But I
Hmm.
think this is also tricky because then that influences when are you actually competing, which often is not as malleable, right? It's usually a set time that everyone is going to have to compete regardless of
Yeah.
your chronotype. So I think one factor then to consider in that scenario is also just keeping in mind what time you'll be trained, what time you'll be competing, so that you can also potentially align if you have the ability in your schedule to match that, so it's synchronized. Because I've seen sometimes um, athletes often training at a very different time than they will actually compete. And that's one thing I know, just as one example, in like the Rio Olympics, it was,
Mm,
a really big issue in terms of how teams were going to train for swim finals, because the swim finals were occurring at around midnight, which is when athletes should be sleeping. And so there was this big question of how to lead up to the Rio Olympics and how to shift everyone's training schedule and shift their circadian rhythm so they would actually be peaking in their performance around midnight and not
right.
in their typical earlier, obviously in the daytime, because peak performance in a normal 24 hours is in the late afternoon to evening period. And that's when performance is best. That's when world records are broken. And so it was really interesting to see different countries kind of approach this somewhat similarly, but also just knowing that they had to shift entire schedules in the weeks leading into those Rio Olympics. So very much so, you have to keep in mind the time in which is ultimately going to matter.
Yeah, well, and it's like, I mean, just even this last week, I think the Tennessee Titans, I think they kicked off at like 10:20 Eastern time. And I was like, that's 9:20 their time typically. Like that's crazy to me. And
And that's
some of these NBA games in the bubble are starting after 9 o'clock on the East Coast. And I'm like, that can't be setting these guys up for success, especially those who likely, I imagine there's a good chunk of those guys who are morning people.
mhm.
And it seems like it's fighting their physiology to have to be asked to do that. And I was wondering if at the professional level, like one, I guess hopefully they would start to take that into consideration from a schedule standpoint. But I wonder, does it even get so advanced to where like the team itself is aware of what players kind of have a specific, predilection, and are they taking that into consideration with like who they're playing?
Mhm. All good questions. I think that it's harder, obviously, and more challenging in a team based sport like football and with an entire roster to be able to tease apart the chronotype and then adjust the training schedules, because they often are just very set in kind of the typical training kind of hours during the daytime. But I think it's easier on an individual athlete level, right? If you're a marathon
Yeah.
runner or you're someone who does more individual training, to manipulate potentially some of your scheduling to match what you would do when it comes to your event time.
Yeah.
I think you have great you have great foresight that those are things that should be coming down the road. But I think that
Hmm.
we're still trying to even get most of a team on board with recognizing that this is an important component that they should individually be focused on, even nailing just the duration and making some progress on the quality. And then once we can get at a more granular level, definitely that's when it gets really fun with the athletes that are fascinated with the research. And if
Yeah.
they do off-season training, those are the conversations that I have with them of trying to do things on a more individualized level that is going to be preferential to how they would best train.
Ah, very cool. This has just been so interesting, and I'm sure, if allowed, I could probably ask you questions for another 2 hours. But I think people are certainly going to take a lot away from this one. For people who would actually like to follow the work that you're doing, is there anywhere that we can kind of follow along? Any social channels?
Definitely. So the best way to follow my work and some of the projects that I'm involved in is Twitter. My handle is Cheri_Mah. So that's CHERI_MAH. And then it's the same handle for Instagram. And if there's any other questions, you can also email me. My email is SheriMah@StanfordAlumni.org.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll make all those available in the show notes. I think people will love to track what you're doing. No pun intended. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you. We'll have to have you back in the future. And so I'll be interested to see kind of what comes out of this whole bubble scenario and to see if there is any interesting learnings that eventually we take away from that. Because it's just, I mean, I don't think anyone ever thought there would be an opportunity to see what happens if you get the world's best athletes to literally live in a bubble for months on end
It's a
and
very
compete at the highest
fascinating
level.
scenario. Yeah, it will be interesting to see what comes out of this and what next season looks like. But for the time being, it has been a very interesting season so far.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Well, awesome. Thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. I hope you sleep well tonight.
Yeah. Thank you.